Hello, welcome to this session on power and influencing as part of the Developing Strategic Leadership Skills module. So first of all, let's think about what influencing is. The Roffey Park Institute, which is a charitable trust which engages in a lot of personal development, including things like leadership development for both public and private sector organisations, talks about the fact that influencing is when we behave in a way that invites other people to actually change, to change their own behaviour, their attitudes and so on, in order to accommodate what we want them to do. So it's that invitation, but also accepting that people might not be able in some instances and might not be willing to actually make those changes we want them to make. What it's not is getting other people to agree with us or winning an argument at all costs, so having to come out on top, or coercing people to change. Now, influencing is perhaps the core of what leadership is, or that element that pretty much most writers can agree on. Leadership is this huge concept, and it incorporates a whole range of behaviours and traits, as we know. Herminia Ibarra, in her 2015 book, says the closest to a consensus that we might have on leadership is Peter Northhouse's definition, and that's a process whereby an individual influences a group of other individuals to achieve some common goal. Now, as leaders or managers within organisations, we are seeking to influence things quite a lot of the time. It might be what strategy we use or tactics or actions we take. All of us try and influence to some degree the impressions that other people have of us. We want often people to think that we are competent, confident and so on, and we might have a range of different things that we want to kind of convey to people if we're trying to advance our careers. Now, power and influence, and in fact authority, are quite closely intertwined. Power is a relational concept, and by that we mean that we all have power in some situations but not in others, and we have more or less power in relation to other people in a particular situation. So it is a situational concept, and it is distinct from, but as I say, quite often related to authority, so positions of authority, and to influence as well. Now, power is something that resides in authority, according to Max Weber, one of the founding fathers of sociology. So he talked about the fact that roles such as managerial roles are granted a certain degree of authority and power over other people, and that's accepted, or accepted to a certain extent. So Barnard talked about management and about how employees will have what he called a zone of indifference. So they accept and almost expect their managers to have influence and authority over them in certain areas of their life. But there's a kind of line that is there, and if that manager then starts to cross what is seen as that acceptable line, so they move then into a zone where employees are far from indifferent to what they're doing, and may well kind of resist and push back against what that manager's trying to do. So authority is the potential to influence what happens. So position gives us that authority, but having actual power is the actual ability to influence what people do or influence what actually happens within a situation. So Weber suggested, well, senior figures, senior managers may have authority. They don't necessarily have the ability to influence other people and get them to do what they want. It's going to depend really on the situation. So there are lots of situations as managers and leaders where we do need to influence when having difficult conversations, as we might call them. Quite often that's part and parcel of performance management, talking about people's performance, talking also sometimes then about career aspirations. Sometimes they can be quite difficult conversations that we do need to have. There might be others, redundancy situations, those kind of things where things are changing quite dramatically for a person or for the organisation. We need to influence when we can see that something might be about to go wrong, and sometimes that is easier downwards than it is upwards. If we see senior people to us who perhaps lack some expertise, lack certain skills maybe in terms of handling people, and we might see that they're behaving in ways or trying to do something, and that's likely to have disastrous or not favourable outcomes, and we've got to try and influence them quite subtly, quite sensitively. Processes of change, when we're trying to actually kind of progress change, then certainly we need to be mindful of people's situations and to influence rather than to really work on trying to coerce people. Now, power has been talked about as a shifting phenomenon. I said it at the start, then it's a relational concept. And we've seen some shifts in power in recent decades. There's been discussion about the shift in power from employer to employee in certain situations. And if we think about situations where there are particular skill shortages, perhaps areas like STEM is quoted, then talented employees, those who've got high levels of skill that are in great demand, are going to have greater power to influence what actually happens to them, to perhaps negotiate their way, their salary, their way into an organisation, what their ways of working are like, so their overall kind of package, terms and conditions and so on. There's discussion about the shift from, large, big multinational type corporations to much smaller companies. So the idea of the large company and economies of scale seems to be less valued than it once was. So people are more interested in more boutique type products, more personalisation of products, greater, agility and flexibility, where smaller firms tend to have advantages. And certainly there does seem to be some shift there. We've seen perhaps younger generations pushing back against some of the big brand names and their dominance, and actually going for more unbranded type products in certain kind of areas, so that's become more prevalent. There's been a shift in terms of from government control to private sector, so deregulation of particular kind of areas. That's transformed particular kind of sectors and aspects of society. And if we think about something like healthcare, where there was the setting up of commissioning groups, clinical commissioning groups, they suddenly got more power in the overall kind of health system as the buyers of services. So we've seen that quite a lot in the public sector happen. In terms of the private sector, much more influence for shareholders. We've seen shares moving more into private institutions, investment funds and so on. So those groups having particular influence there. Now, there are a range of power bases or sources of power within organisations. Certain individual sources of power, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as structural sources of power. And those structural sources of power are things like knowledge, and we can think of situations, sometimes change situations, where we've got one or two people in organisations who are really the keepers of particular knowledge, and they're not keen to share it, and they're perhaps historically not being keen to share it because it does give them a certain amount of power and leverage, makes them maybe a little bit more difficult to get rid of. So sometimes people hang on to knowledge for those kind of reasons. Other kinds of resources that are useful within organisations, and then the actual decision making networks, as we might say. So who's involved in those, where does that decision making kind of power lie? So they're sources of power, and then we've got, in terms of whether that leads to influence over others, it depends on the different relationships amongst these different power bases, and what strategies people use to try and influence others. This idea about sources of interpersonal power goes back to the 1950s with French and Raven's work, and they talked about sources of power that have an organisational base, such as our ability to reward people if we are the holder of the rewards, then that gives us a certain power. A coercive kind of power, so that's often linked to kind of position, and that we're able to act in a coercive way, and a legitimate source of power, so that again is linked more to kind of position and an authority. And then we've got the two personal bases, which are being an expert in a particular area, and referent power, which is really when people refer to us or we're seen as role models, and that has links with personal characteristics such as charisma, or the very kind of attractive personalities who seem to be able to get people behind them and on board just by sheer kind of force of personality. Sometimes expertise and being a kind of referent type of person or a role model go together. Sometimes they can be quite separate. We might have people who are have legitimate positions, and they're also experts in a particular area. We might have people in those legitimate positions, but actually there are other people who are the informal have the informal kind of power base, because they are actually the ones who are seen as the real kind of experts in an area. So the manager may be seen as, they're the manager, they're there to do this, that and the other, but actually they don't really know that much about this particular kind of area, and it's somebody else that's really kind of looked to and is actually more influential, and then the manager might need to kind of think about who they're working with and how they're going to actually influence people, how they're going to work with those experts and so on. Now, in more recent years, power and its role really in management and leadership has started to come more into leadership and management development type programs. And in the United States, there's a guy called Barry Oshry, who's a behaviour and systems expert. And within his leadership development programs, then he's long had a simulation exercise known as the Power Lab. And this has been adapted by other organisations. So, for instance, it's been used in the leadership development program with more junior, qualified, but more junior kind of doctors within the English NHS. It was used in one of their well-known leadership programs. And this is about people it's about living in a kind of multi-class society. So people are allocated to what's often known as top, middle or bottom kind of level roles within that society. So they've got access to very different resources. Some have got authority, some have got absolutely no authority, and they play out these particular roles, and they're really have to face over a period of a week when it's used, this exercise, questions about their leadership and what their vision is, how they can actually get their vision put into play or implement a change type of situation, and they have to think about their sources of their power and how they're going to use that, or whether they're going to run away from that, as I said here, and not use it, and so on. So it's a live kind of exercise, and as I say, can be shortened, where people play a kind of top, middle or bottom role within another organisational type, and then maybe swap around those roles to get some insight into different kind of perspectives. So those people who use power and influence effectively tend to be ones who have got a good understanding of their own power base and the different structural sources of power, and they're able to really adapt what they do and use a variety of different sources and influence strategies. Also, they understand this need to reciprocate, this you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of idea, that if somebody is going to do something for them, there's a good chance that they're going to have to repay that favour at some point, and that's how the world works. They understand what is and what isn't legitimate behaviour in getting into a position where they acquire that kind of power. And they show maturity and control in their use of it. So they recognise, actions that they take can have a particular impact on people's lives, and they use their power carefully and sensitively. So the effectiveness of different power and influence tactics is obviously going to depend on the skill of users, and that's often something when people move into more senior roles that they need to adapt to the kind of the authority that they have and the power that comes with that, and how they're going to use it. And sometimes we see people perhaps who've been promoted very quickly within organisations don't have a lot of experience of managing others, and sometimes we see people get a little bit carried away with that sense of kind of authority and power that they have, and then start to abuse it. So how requests are made, and whether people have thought about how that's going to be perceived. And then there are norms, really. So the culture of the organisation, what's accepted, what's acceptable for different people, different levels across the organisation, for people to perhaps give their opinion to try and influence. And then national or more societal level kind of cultural norms will influence. So some of the Asian societies, for instance, then seniority is really respected and valued, perhaps more so than in the US, the UK types of culture. So it will be much less acceptable for perhaps younger, less senior people to really try and influence in some of those cultures. So I spoke earlier about people understanding the need for this kind of reciprocal kind of arrangement and this exchange process, and that tends to make people more effective at influence. And there's this idea of currencies, so resources being a particular kind of currency. Personal support that we can give people is a kind of currency that we can trade, as it is kind of cooperation in the likes of giving people access to our own networks, exposing those to other kind of individuals, or being able to help people advance recognising their efforts. Now, Yuckel and Tracy's work in the 1990s looked at different influencing tactics that people use, and they divided these into hard tactics, which they suggested were less influential, had less good outcomes, versus the softer kind of tactics. And they saw some of these tactics as more focused on self, and some as being more focused on others. So things like rational persuasion, so making a good argument, quite a persuasive kind of argument that we put across well. Socialising with people, getting to know them really, this idea of exchange. Making a personal appeal really to someone, consultation, and then this idea of inspirational appeals, or putting an argument and in a way that is linked to people's kind of sense of values, and it's quite a kind of inspiring, motivational kind of message that's put across. And as I said on the previous slide, they suggested that there were less influential tactics and more positive influential tactics. Now, the idea of coalition is something that we can kind of perhaps talk about a little bit more in face-to-face sessions. Because that's interesting. When we talk about change situations, we sometimes talk about needing to actually build coalitions of support. So we'll think a little bit more about that one. Now, In lots of organisations, as part of personal and leadership type development, education or full programs, talk about different social styles that people have. And this is really about people's preference for receiving information, and how they interact with other people. And this gives us something to kind of think about if we're trying to influence different types of people, how we might make a persuasive argument to different people, or what do we need to do to actually kind of engage those people, get them to listen to us, get them to maybe do what we want them to do. And part of that is thinking about actually what is that person best placed to do, how can they be useful in relation to this situation. This comes from Merrill and Reed, psychologists' work, and then it's been adapted by a lot of consulting companies. Different colours are used sometimes in terms of different companies' kind of approaches to this. Red's often used for people who are put in this driver type category, so quite kind of action oriented kind of people. Maybe if they're very much in this driving kind of category, quite impatient, want real, what is it you want me to do, get to the heart of the matter pretty quickly, otherwise I'm bored with listening to you. Versus perhaps the expressives, who are very much the social butterflies, very well connected, but probably again lose track of things, need constant reminders, but they're the people who can kind of give you access to different networks. So again, that's something we can kind of talk a little bit more in the face-to-face sessions. Now, power and influence in action is often referred to as political behaviour. When we talk about political behaviour, that often conjures up quite negative terms. Lots of people talk about, it's so political, that it's all politics. Well, yes, organisations are all about politics. That is part and parcel of organisations. A definition kind of here that this is about activities that are not really required as part of one's formal role. They're not listed on a job description, but they influence or attempt to influence the distribution of advantages or disadvantages within an organisation. And I think it's probably fair to say that there are categories of behaviour that fall into legitimate political behaviour, the kind of normal everyday politics of organisational life. And then there are behaviours that can be seen to violate the norms of that organisation or that culture. And when we label behaviour as political, we're really implying that certain people are gaining or seeking to gain at the expense of others. We often talk about people, very much focused on their own agenda, and really that's, they're playing to their own agenda rather than perhaps being a team player. So, is political behaviour a good or a bad thing? Well, as I say, often perceived as negative, but really influencing is, about behaving politically. If we're really trying to influence, quite important things within organisations, then we certainly change type situations, then we do need to think about, who do we work with, what resources have they got, how do we interact with them, and so on, and all of that can be seen as kind of quite political, quite strategic. Judging really whether that's gone too far or not, whether it conforms to kind of codes of what's acceptable and seen as ethical. Well, we could judge on these kind of standards whether people are behaving in a way that achieves something for the common good, then we might say that's acceptable. When the usefulness of that behaviour sort of balances out any potential harm that might happen, so it's more useful than it is more harmful, and whether really, as I say, it conforms to norms of equity and justice. But all of those ideas are change over time. They're very, very much of their time, and what's seen as kind of ethical perhaps in one period is certainly not seen as ethical or acceptable within another period of time or another type of organisation. This is an example from Glassdoor, the website where current or former employees quite often leave comments about particular organisations. And this is one about Goldman Sachs back in 2014, and somebody's talking about the pros of working for Goldman Sachs and saying, well, one pro is that they really need technical people who are quite rational and pragmatic. It seems they've got quite a pool of converted interns, quite a lot of inexperienced people. This person saying, I can easily outperform my peers, but the actual benefit of doing that's low, because that outperforming person is kind of leached by their peers, and managers tend to perhaps relegate responsibilities. Perhaps a suggestion they dump tasks on these people if you're seen as quite a high performer. So you need to learn to stop working and go home. The only outcome is that the chance of being laid off is low. So if you perform, you're not likely to be laid off. The cons of working here are a vicious and political corporate culture. And suggestions here, there's an annual culling of low performers, which happens in some of these big financial types of institutions, big consulting type companies. And it's that kind of orientation, that way of managing performance, that frequently causes people to be quite politically oriented. So people are really defending their own position, thinking about what they need to do to maintain themselves in a job, basically. So in terms of factors that influence political behaviour, quite a range of factors. There are individual factors, so certain individuals seem more likely to engage in this type of political behaviour. People who are high self-monitors, so people who are trying to kind of adapt and fit to their local environment, taking a lot of social cues around them and adapting to that. People who've got high internal locus of control, for instance. So they think that they can control a situation and outcomes more than they are at the whim of circumstances or events. So people who've got a high external locus of control tend to think that outside situational factors will influence them. High Machiavellian personality type, so quite self-centered, narcissistic personality kind of types are more likely to kind of engage in this kind of behaviour. If there's a high level of organisational investment and perceptions of job alternatives, so perhaps if we think that there are good job prospects somewhere and we generally like the organisation, but those job prospects are rather limited, they're quite competitive, then we'll behave in ways to try and get ourselves kind of noticed, and maybe to kind of stand out versus other people, and that links to our expectations of success. And then a range of organisational factors to do with resources, opportunities for promotion, the level of trusts, whether roles are clear or not, and quite ambiguous, uncertain, changeable situations can lead to political behaviour. Performance systems that are not very clear, anything sort of reward type practices really where people lose out. Democratic decision making, people might kind of fight to get their kind of voice heard. Pressures on performance, we talked about that in relation to Goldman Sachs just now, and rather self-serving senior kind of managers might influence that as well. So different range of factors that will influence the chances of people kind of behaving in this way and perhaps getting away with behaving in this way. Other organisational drivers, I've just talked now a little bit about ambiguous and uncertain environments, but where there's a lot of disagreement, perhaps over what goals should even be, even what issues an organisation's facing. Sometimes it's not really clear what the root cause of problems in an organisation are. And then we can see quite a lot of kind of infighting and political behaviour to if somebody believes quite passionately that they know what the issues are and what should happen. Scarce resources, organisations, that kind of culture that rewards it, as we've talked about already. And finally, Buchanan and Badham did some work back in the 90s talking about behaviours that are seen as more negative. So one of these is about not really committing yourself to a position or to a particular kind of project or program. So keep giving yourself some flexibility. That might be understandable in some situations, but there is an element of kind of perhaps scheming and political kind of ness that's seen in relation to that, certainly by other people. We've talked about withholding information when people have knowledge and perhaps don't share particular forms of information. Seeming to compromise and seeming to go with the party line with the team perhaps, but continuing really on, a bit under the radar to press ahead with someone's own agenda. Inspiring confidence and giving the impression of always knowing what you're doing even when you don't. That's an interesting one that we can talk about as well. That Herminia Ribara's book about think like a leader, act like a leader, draws on this older concept of fake it till you make it. And leaders, people perhaps when they're first in leadership positions, having to convey that kind of impression that they do know what they're doing. So there may be some good reasons really why people are trying to give that impression, but we know that well-respected leaders are those people who will admit when they don't know as well now, particularly more senior leaders, that if more senior leaders will admit, I don't have all the answers, I don't know, I'm open to your expertise and to listening, then those people are much better accepted. So that brings us to the end of this session on power and influencing, and a few ideas that we will pick up in the face-to-face sessions. Thank you for listening.